Okay, so welcome everyone. This is June 25th. I think it's our second, maybe third AI expert meeting, and very happy to have you join us. So at Xavier Health, at Xavier University, we kicked off some artificial intelligence work a number of years ago, and it's really evolved to develop a really nice community of people that are all over the world. And we've recognized that part of that community is a group of AI experts like yourselves, and I am not an AI expert. So we thought, wouldn't it be great if we could get you together and you guys could talk shop? So we do truly vet out this group to make sure that AI experts join in. And by that, when you have discussions or questions, you don't have to explain what is artificial intelligence like you might have to for me. You can just jump right in and start using the language that you guys know how to speak to each other. So today our focus is going to be on developing AI-enabled smart medical devices using model-based design. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kirthi, which I believe you're able to control my screen. Is that right?
Yes, I can.
Yay. Yeah. Okay, there you go.
Okay, so, all right, so hello everyone. My name is Kirthi Devleker. I'll be your host for today. And before I start, I'll just quickly give you a high-level agenda. So we have the whole hour we have right now. We are splitting up into 3 sections. First, we'll quickly go through some introductions. Real quick about the Xavier AI initiative, and also we'll also introduce ourselves. And immediately after that, we will start today's discussion on the topic is going to be focused on approaches for signal or 1D signal classification. So that'll be the bulk of the presentation. We expect it to be around 30 minutes, but we do want to make it interactive. So feel free to jump in or ping your questions in the chat, and we'll certainly try and answer them as we go along. Our goal is to keep this meeting very informal, and so please feel free to interrupt whenever you have a question. And finally, I think we'll still leave some time towards the end on some questions or discussions where we'll have a full-fledged discussion. And if you have any suggestions for future topics, that's also a good time for you to share your ideas and thoughts, and we can certainly consider that and take it from there. Okay. So, all right. So with that, let's get started. So first, just quickly want to introduce Xavier AI initiative. I think as Marla said, basically this is a group. It's a collaborative group formed with AI experts. The main idea here is to get people who are interested in AI come together to benefit the overall healthcare community. So the scope, we'll be focusing only on discussion of best practices, exchanges, ideas, and experiences. And the group is led by 3 people. Simon, he is a lead here, and he works in Genentech's digital health technology organization. Followed by Arvind. Arvind is also a faculty member in the Department of Computations and University of Michigan. And myself, I'm Kirthi Devleker. I'm also a lead here, and I'm also a presenter for today. So I'm the global industry manager at Medical Devices Industry Manager at MathWorks. Okay, so now I'll get started with a quick round of introduction. So as I mentioned earlier, my name is Kirthi Devleker. I'm the Global Medical Devices Industry Manager at MathWorks. A big part of my job revolves around working with the top medical device companies, especially their R&D teams, in terms of helping them build the next generation medical devices safely and efficiently. I'm also joined with my colleague. Maybe I'll let him introduce himself. Akhilesh, could you please quickly introduce yourself?
Well, hello everyone. I'm Akhilesh. I'm a senior applications engineer at MathWorks. I do support Kirthi with a lot of work in the medical industry. My background is signal processing and AI, and today I'll be more than happy to discuss some few things which we've been doing recently. So thank you. Thanks a lot for having me here.
Yeah, thanks, Akhilesh. So throughout the presentation, we will be going back and forth between me and Akhilesh. And the topic again is developing AI-enabled smart medical devices. And as we were thinking about this topic, we thought we'd really pick a particular focus area. The focus area was, we thought it would be good to share our experiences in terms of how people could build AI-enabled devices, especially using machine learning or deep learning in the medical devices areas, right? So you can do that with the model-based design approach. We can cover that later if you're interested. But for now, we want to focus mainly on the technology and the workflows that are involved. So there are three goals of this presentation, right? So, or maybe two goals mainly. One is we want to share our experience here, the lessons learned in building some of the AI-based classification models, which involve 1D signals. So 1D physiological signals are ECG, EMG. The workflows we are going to show are going to be applicable for any type of physiological signal. And the main idea is we will walk through this workflows. Like we have like 4 workflows, again, just to give you an idea of how you can leverage. The main idea here is to leverage the latest technology and see if you can incorporate it and discuss the results, like results and pros and cons of those approaches. Just keep it at a discussion level for now. And finally, we have plenty of time for Q&A towards the end. Now, before we jump in, we have a few disclaimers here. So the views that we're sharing in this presentation are based on our own. So this is coming from our own experience in building AI models. We are very hands-on as far as building these models. And a lot of that is coming from the work that we've done or worked with large medical device companies. And the second part is we're going to be showing you some benchmarks just to kind of give you an idea as to what it would take and how would things be if you were to pick a particular approach. So there will be some numbers and benchmarks. So please take it with a pinch of salt, because depending on the environment, like hardware and software platforms you use, the results may vary a bit. But the overall idea is, at least if you look at it from a relative scale of reference, you should still, the relative scales should be certainly something comparable. And to develop these, this is going to be a little technical discussion. So to come up with these workflows, we've used MATLAB and Simulink for most of our work. And yeah. So I'm going to quickly get started with maybe just to clear the air on some terminologies and topics people use in AI. When people say AI, there are 2 things that come up. One is machine learning. And essentially machine learning, I think, as most of you probably know, it's just basically, an ability of a machine to learn from data without inherently being or explicitly being programmed. Now, how you can do that is based on, getting some more data and identifying something relevant within that data and training a machine so that it can understand the patterns. So that's machine learning. But of late, I think in the last few years, we've been seeing this deep learning that's almost kind of replacing a lot of the traditional machine learning workflows. Not really replacing, but I should take my words back. It's more like there are some newer developments here that we could probably leverage. And the idea is it kind of automates a few pieces of if you look at the workflow or the journey in building models using machine learning, there are a few things that it automates, and that's why I think deep learning is really coming in. So we just wanted to kind of put that at a high level, right? So now jumping into today's workflow. So I think what we have at the core is, in order to be able to compare and contrast these different workflows, because many people kind of have the first question is, which approach do I choose? We started with an example. So the example is EKG classification. And what we will do is we'll first look at a couple of workflows, essentially within the deep learning realm, where we kind of classify EKG signals using convolutional neural networks and LSTM networks, right? So that's one. Those are the 2 workflows. And then we'll also look at some traditional methods using machine learning. And again, that probably would involve some manual feature extraction and again, some automated feature extraction. So we'll just cover this. And if you have any questions, as I mentioned earlier, feel free to jump in, okay? So for the focus of today's focus is mainly going to be on these 2 approaches, CNNs and LSTMs, and we'll just share some more details about the machine learning part towards the later part of the presentation. So feel free to ping in your questions. I'm also trying to monitor the chat, and if you have any questions anytime, just feel free to ping in there, right? So before we jump into the example or the workflow itself, I first want to put this out here. Many people, when they actually have, let's say, data and they're looking at building a model, the biggest question they have on their minds is which direction they want to go for AI, right? So in some sense, that question could be answered based on how much time you have. Like what I mean by this is, let's say you're working on some project, you don't really have like years or months to spare, maybe something you want to do real quick. So that's one dimension of looking at it. And then the other part is how much data you have, right? So the data volume could also dictate what approach you take. And in some sense, I mean, there's no right or wrong answer. So that's why we wanted to try out all these approaches. And we want to kind of share with you whatever we've learned here, okay? One quick piece on FDA, because I think this is all medical devices. I think a lot of the work that's done in medical devices is under the, I would say, purview of FDA, at least here in the US. I think the good news there is FDA has been really, welcoming AI. I mean, they're kind of recognized that this is a technology that's going to be here to stay. And FDA also believes, and this is from their website, they think AI can potentially unlock insights. And in fact, FDA has also kind of approved recently, maybe last year, a first device that actually has AI built in. This is an ultrasound software that guides users. And there are some more guidelines that are evolving, but I think the good news is I think FDA is really interested in this, and also they're starting to get some devices which have AI. But one thing that's kind of very important here is, I think, to mention is, and this is something that's emphasized also by FDA, is interpretability and explainability is certainly very important, right? So you really need to know, it's not just enough to know or build something, you also need to know how that thing is working. So I think there's also an emphasis on that. Okay, so getting into the data source. So for the examples of the workflows, we thought we'll just use one common data set, and we are using PhysioNet dataset. So for people who are not familiar, PhysioNet is basically a consortium. It's a free, I would say, it's a website that hosts a lot of clinically validated or annotated data. So there are people in MIT and Harvard here who are kind of taking all the data from hospitals in and around Massachusetts, and you have experts like cardiologists annotate it, and there are technical people who are kind of making this data available to the public. So we are using this data set, and the goal here is to build a model that can classify or at least identify signals belonging to one of these three classes. So ARR is arrhythmia, CHF is congestive heart failure, and NSR is normal sinus rhythm. So each signal has like 65,000 samples, which kind of maps to 512 seconds of data that's acquired at 128 hertz. And we will use this data set throughout all the workflows that we're going to talk about. Okay, so now with that in place, so now we'll move on to the first topic for today, which is EKG classifications using time frequency representation and CNNs. So just to give you a high-level overview of this approach, so typically the workflow, I mean, whenever you think of deep learning as such, the main idea is to kind of, there are three main steps involved, right? You kind of get your data and your act together, make sure it's all labeled and annotated. In some cases, you probably need experts to annotate it. But once you're done with that, you kind of train a model. And once you train a model, then there's also this thought of, okay, what do you want to do with the model? You want to maybe put it in a cell phone, maybe, or some kind of a smaller wearable device, or say you want to take that model or algorithm and put it on the cloud. So I think there's a lot of, and it really depends on what kind of business challenge you have. But the good news is you have to think about all these things, and while the choice of your workflow can really be dictated by where you want to deploy your algorithm. So this is going to be this is not going to be like, oh, you just start with something and you get something out of it. It's going to be more like an iterative approach. So the main workflow today is, I mean, we take some signals, for instance, and now what we want to do is we want to leverage some of the good work that was already done in the area of deep learning, especially in the area of convolutional neural networks. So what we'll focus on is leveraging some transfer learning models. And these transfer learning models will be trained on some time frequency representations, and we will get into the details of why these time frequency, what it is, and so on and so forth. But the main idea is, if you want to build something really quick, then maybe take some deep networks that are already trained and pre-trained, customize it, and then use it for your purpose here. And once you train the model, most of the results I'm going to be talking about are on the test set. So you take some new signals that the model has never seen, take the same workflow, and then make the model predict what kind of class the signal belongs. So in this workflow, if you notice, there are two main things here. One is the transfer learning or the deep network model, and then there is a time frequency representation, right? So how do you go about, picking, let's say, how do you get a starting point? So in some sense, you can think of a deep network as a neural network which has some input and output layers, and in between you have some bunch of hidden layers. And the idea of these hidden layers is they kind of extract some patterns from your input representations. So when you have your signals, that's one of the reasons why we are looking at taking the signals and converting it into a representation that this deep network will understand, which is a 2D time frequency representation. And the hypothesis is these hidden layers will learn some patterns that have probably clear in your input layer and make a prediction. So with this out, I think the main idea here is CNNs typically work on images, as most of you know. Time frequency representations can be a good source of input to these networks, and this approach can serve as a good starting point. So you have a representation, the CNNs kind of work on image, and then you get some output. Now the big question here is, the input we have is not an image, it's a signal, right? So how do you bridge that gap? So one way to bridge that gap is to kind of take the signal and convert it into a time frequency representation. And if you're looking at the time frequency representations, basically the idea of a time frequency representation is to take a signal and see how it evolves, how the frequency components evolve as a function of time. And in some sense, that looks like a pattern, or that kind of represents itself as a pattern. And the hypothesis is, if you give this pattern as an input to the deep network, hopefully it can extract all the relevant features from that pattern, right? So there are different time frequency techniques to choose from. I'm not going to go over all these details. There are subtle changes here depending on what you're doing, but for today's presentation, we will be using this technique called scaleogram, and we will certainly share why we are choosing this and the results we've got, okay? So I just want to pause here real quick, and Akhilesh, if you have anything to add to what I said so far, please feel free to jump in.
I think Kirthi, all good so far. Nothing
Okay.
To add at this point. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, just a quick primer on time frequency transformation. So the idea is, when you have a signal here, your signal could be any physiological signal. The notion of time frequency transform is you kind of take your signal, chunk it up into different time segments, and for each time segment, you compute or identify what are the frequency components present. So that's like a basic way of thinking about time frequency transformation. So that's what gets you this image, right? So the four are out of the multiple approaches I mentioned. I think we are going to use this scaleogram technique because it's very well suited for real world signals, like sensor signals, which have features occurring at different scales. So capturing the spectrum of those signals is really important, and as long as you can faithfully capture that information, the job of the network kind of relatively becomes easier, right? So that's the main idea here. To that could influence which technique you want to choose. So we are going to choose the scaleogram technique, as I mentioned, and now I want to contrast this scaleogram technique with spectrogram, which I think most of people in this area probably know. So the difference here is, in the traditional techniques like spectrograms, you need to really tell or dictate the size of the window, right? And that could be challenging again. So we want to make it easier for people. So for real world signals, your features could be occurring at different scales. So this is an EKG signal, right? So now you have a feature that is maybe more like, coming in at a lower frequency, and then compared with this QRS complex, that's relatively higher frequency. So you want to be able to preserve this information. And there is some kind of smudging that happens depending on the choice of the segment size you choose. And inherently what happens is it fails to capture features occurring at different scales. So in other words, if you choose a shorter window, you're basically biasing your time representations towards abrupt changes. The longer window captures like slow varying changes, but you lose out the abrupt changes. So in order to be able to, kind of address that, we are going to be choosing the time frequency approach with wavelets. And so here's one example of spectrogram, right? So you have EKG signal here. If you choose a spectrogram, this is your representation. So this is your time And this is your frequencies, and the color here donates the power of those frequency components, right? So as you can see, there is some blurring effect here that happens, and smearing effect. And that's because of the technique that's used. That's nothing to do with the signal itself, right? So now if you look at the time frequency analysis using wavelets, what happens is now you have the ability to use variable size windows. And this technique can now identify those components in your signals pretty easily. So these wavelets are again shifted and scaled. So the idea here is to resolve higher frequency components in time and lower frequency components in frequency. And the reason why we are doing it is to get back to the main point. You kind of get a nice representation of how your signals kind of look. So I just have a small visual here. The way it works is, so you have start with a mother wavelet, you kind of compare it with the original signal, you get a set of coefficients. Now you stretch the wavelet or shrink the wavelet, and then you stretch the wavelet. So with every stretching and shrinking, you're now capturing things that are occurring within your signal at different scales. And that kind of gives rise to a pattern, right? So now instead of using the spectrogram pattern, we are using these patterns. And now if you can see your QRS complex here, right? So this is your heartbeat essentially, right? So your heartbeat, if you look at the time frequency space, your heartbeats are very well spaced, right? So compared to the spectrogram image, and you can literally see, you can also make some measurements here, like what's the frequency range of this. So the idea is this could actually serve as a pattern, right? And now if you can provide this as an input to a deep network, maybe it can extract all the features. So one analogy I want to give you here is, let's say if you have like 10 friends, right? And if I blindfold you, or maybe if I just give you a picture of your friend, blur it a little bit and ask you to recognize who the friend is, maybe you'll guess it correctly. But imagine a situation where you have 100 friends. And if I blur out the image of your friend and ask you to, you probably won't get, you won't be able to, identify it with good accuracy. So that's the main idea here. Getting sharp time frequency representations can really help. So this is the comparison, as you can see here, right? So that's one of the reasons why we're choosing this approach. And the benefits is you don't have to provide any parameters. It kind of works very well. And when we kind of took this, so speeding up real quickly here, when we took this and when we took it to a deep network and trained it, what we got was, for the most part, all these workflows that we've got 99% accuracy on all the test sets. So we want to compare how fast or how much time the network is taking to make the prediction. So in this case, with this approach, it roughly is coming down to 3.4 seconds for a signal, right? So for a signal of 65,000 samples, we're getting this. Now, so the question here is, now that there is an additional dimension of inference speed, you could use that to, figure out if this approach is better or works for your situation, right? So that's one data point to think of. So I'll pause here for a few seconds and then I'll see if there are any questions. Anybody, any questions here?
And this is Marla. I'll just invite you to unmute your lines and ask questions. If we were all together on Xavier's campus, we'd be in a room and you guys would be talking. So just unmute your lines. It's a very casual discussion, even if it's just a reaction to what you've seen, or have you used anything like this?
I have a question, and sorry, my video is just not working today. So we look at here, this is very interesting with the, now kind of looking at data points through performance, and performance can mean many different things. And so you look at the inference time here as one benchmark. I'm having personally a hard time with my own project, if you will, in understanding what benchmarks matter at what time. And maybe this is a little bit more of a future topic that I was going to bring up anyways, but just looking at, if we have a model now that's trained, and you have that kind of earlier slide between the, the model training to the deployment, between those two, I'm getting the sense that I need to validate and have some hard number data point metrics to kind of demonstrate that our model is actually effective. What does effective and performance mean, and how did you go about understanding the benchmarks necessary to do that? Thank you.
That's a very good question, Dan. And I think in some sense, so from our perspective, we were just approaching from a technical aspect. But let's say if somebody were to take this and maybe demonstrate the effectiveness. I think last year there was a workshop at FDA I attended, and they said, it really is important to validate this on humans and see, especially with, let's say, cardiologists, what is their take and how is this model comparing with how a cardiologist would annotate the signal, right? So in some sense, there is some subjective aspect of it, and of course there's a lot of objective aspects where we can probably add some more data, train it, see that the validation set is being generalized very well compared to the training set, and so on and so forth. So I think there are a few things there, but Akhilesh, maybe I'll also see if you have to add anything there to address Dan's question.
Yeah, definitely, Kirthi. So a great question. Thanks for asking that, Dan. So additionally to what Kirthi said, just one more point. I mean, in terms of the validation from going just before the deployment, we did not do it explicitly, but again, going back to the problem of interpretability and explainability, then there are certain algorithms like Lime and GradCam, which we can use to have that piece validated, that why we are getting this prediction, or what is the noise threshold. Let's say if our signal, let's say assume a case where we're gonna get some adversarial attack, or maybe the signal quality is even just poor enough, then we can actually quantify at what signal to noise ratio will our deep learning model actually predict the right thing, and till what point, and have that validated that, okay, if it is below this level, then we can just discard the results because we know for sure that this model will not work. So there are different approaches to attack that problem. We haven't done it thoroughly, I guess, just because we were never going on with the aim of building an actual device. But there are certainly ideas and concepts and a few things which we have done, which we'll be happy to share with you as well.
Yeah.
Got it. Thank you. And this is just more of a rhetorical question, I guess, wanted to throw out there is, if truly building AI software is different from traditional software application development with mobile and web apps, how different then does the validation aspect kind of come into play? Do we leverage the previous methodologies that we know of in our science classes, or do we have to kind of rethink and provision kind of new ways of thinking about this? So that's just a question I wanted to throw out there. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a good question. And yeah, I mean, it really depends. I mean, I would say the way we think about it is, at least our personal opinion is, all the things that we've done in the past would actually serve as a good reference to whenever you're introducing something new. And the main idea is to see what value this new technique brings in. Now, one area where this could really bring in value is when you have lots and lots of data. So imagine there's been a lot of talk about the models being very general or very specific to a certain demographic population or things like that. Are the things that we don't know, that we're kind of making those assumptions in the past that we probably didn't know about? So I think there's some potential here. So it's definitely a good question, Dan.
And I guess if I could add something, and this could be totally wrong, so I'm throwing it out there as well. But from a quality perspective, which is my background, from what I'm seeing in the whole evolution, is that we want to try to get the validation to be similar to what we understand in the world of validation, which is you change something, it'll never change again. It'll be consistent. And then you've got deep learning or machine learning where it constantly changes. So when we talk about validation, we're moving towards thinking of, well, validating the credibility of the data or the inputs, validating how the algorithm was trained, but then also putting in the historical components of computer system validation, which is evolving towards computer software assessment and using RISC. So I think it's evolving, is my take on it, but maybe you guys see it differently.
That's totally accurate, Marla.
I have one question, since we're talking about validation. Excuse me. To just back it up a little bit, is there a way to, I don't know, parameterize the design inputs in a certain way? I mean, there's some special characteristics of AI that we can talk about in terms of the design inputs that are parameterizable to some extent, do you think?
Yeah, so from what I know, Larry, I think there's there's people call that as experiments, right? So you can certainly come up with some experiments or some Monte Carlo simulations, and again, sky's the limit there. But I don't really have like a concrete answer to your question, but I'm pretty sure there should be something along those lines from a computational angle to explore different areas.
Hi, Kirthi.
I just wanted to bring a point that I think one of your slides made earlier, Kirthi, as well as this question that Larry asked. You had this slide where you talked about this bivariate relationship between data volume and need. And you had this little box on the bottom right that talks about, that showed a workflow. So I'm almost thinking digital twin. And the reason I think digital twin is because you could use a twin properly parameterized as a model to generate data that you expect to see.
Yeah.
And not only does that help you create more data if it's fabricated correctly, but also can help you make much more realistic assessments of credibility that the model can then manufacture. So I guess it handles those questions simultaneously. Maybe it's the same thing, maybe it's not, but that's what I could get from Larry's point.
Yeah, that's kind of
so
like
So that's the whole segue to model-based design aspect. So that's why we didn't want to go in there. Because I think we can have a separate discussion on this altogether. So we're happy to, if you're interested, Larry, maybe we can get offline and have a conversation for sure.
Hi, Kirthi. I just have a question about your data source. So knowing about the EKG signals, most of the time we actually are dealing with normal sinus rhythm, and rarely we actually get arrhythmias or things. So you picked the performance metric as accuracy. Is your data set actually balanced, that we are actually focusing on accuracy to compare the performances among the models, or were you also like, you haven't presented, but you are also looking at sensitivity, specificity, or other metrics?
That's a very good question, Rizwan. And I think so our data is completely imbalanced. So if you look at this data source and PhysioNet, it's imbalanced. There is more normal data than arrhythmias. So yeah, we haven't really, and that was out of the scope for us. We just wanted to look at one metric, freeze it, and then look at it from a dimension of what would happen if you deploy it, right? So we just want to take it to the next level and see if that's something we could use as an indicator, or maybe a way to figure out what approach we take. So there's certainly, there are some examples here. I can point you to those examples. We have a lot of sensitivity, specificity, all those things listed. In fact, I can maybe just now show you this. So this work, actually, NVIDIA invited us to present a talk at NVIDIA GTCs, and we actually have we have actually covered a lot of those things in depth, and there's also some other examples we can share links to. So here's a link. I can probably share this with you later on. Oops, I shouldn't have clicked that. Oh, never mind. So
now that you have clicked it, maybe grab the URL there and toss it in the chat box or something.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, since you're there. And while you're doing that, so I just jotted down, and Larry, I think you're the one who asked it, is parameterized design inputs. Is that, I'm just trying to capture a possible next topic. Does that describe what your target was?
Just an idea. I'm just trying to understand, we're, as Arvind was mentioning, that was like one of the aspects I was kind of driving at, is like, okay, here's generated types of, so when you talk about validation, well, you're talking about the validation of the design, you're talking about, validation of a lot of different aspects of it. And I always start at the design inputs, I guess.
Yeah. And what's interesting is in November is when our AI summit is, and the workshop is focused on basically taking some of our quality systems that exist today and figuring out how they can work for AI, instead of, we've got to create brand new systems for everything. And so we're definitely going to be talking about the design, the whole design control series, including design inputs, and looking at that from the lens of AI, just to give you a feel for that.
Hey, I've got a question on the balancing of the data, or using balanced data. I'm not sure exactly. I'm not a mathematician. I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, but I'm wondering if you use a data set that actually has, for example, one congestive heart failure in 10,000 versus one in 10, That's two different data sets on training. Would the algorithms train differently and operate differently or not?
That's a good question. I think the more data, at least from our experience, what we've seen is the generalizability aspect of the model starts to change with more data. In your previous case, when you mentioned if you have lots of data in one class and hardly on the other class, I think the model starts to, guess that it's going to be incorrectly guess that it's going to be probably based on the other first class, right? So it will probably do some misclassifications there. So I think that point you probably want to ask your question, is machine or deep learning really the approach to go, right? Maybe it's a hand-coded rules that could probably help you build a model.
Yeah,
so
yeah, I was asking because, I wonder if a parameter might be the known frequency of the conditions that you're looking for within the normal data.
Yeah, that could be the case, right? And we could use that as a rule and maybe just apply that instead of training an AI model.
And Kirthi, if you don't mind, can I just add something real quick to this?
Please, yes, please.
Since we're talking about the balanced data set and unbalanced data set, I would like to point this out from our own experience, like when we were working with this. So this data set has only like 162 records, but in a few experimentation, I did explore the idea of like, what if we use a balanced data set and how does the network performs? And one takeaway, which I certainly got is, so I think more than the AI piece, what really is important is how we are doing a signal transformation in the beginning, like what Kirthi showed. So the first step which we did was we did a scalogram calculation. And the technique used for doing that transformation and how much of a fidelity does that provide to capture those subtle nuances, which differentiates normal rhythm from an arrhythmia, but then also captures the similarity of normal rhythm of 10 different patients. So I think that signal processing or the feature extraction, if you call it, or whatever we do in the beginning for that signal transformation is a very key aspect. And if we get that piece right, the performances which I have seen from my own personal experience is like a CNN was not doing a very good job. But then the second technique which I used was using a scattering network that was beautifully, or I should say like with a very high fidelity, capturing those subtle nuances that even if I had 30, what I did in my experiment was I used 30 normal rhythm, 30 arrhythmia, and 30 congestive heart failure. So I just shortened the data set even more. But then when I trained it with a balanced data set, also I saw that I tested it out on my own normal rhythm. And I plugged in the ECG sensors on my own body. And then I asked a few of my friends to come in to test that model out. And it was giving 100% accuracy for all the people I tried. The normal rhythm was getting accurately classified. And then obviously the arrhythmia and congestive heart failure were all the test data pre-saved. Fortunately, none of my friends had that any issue. But the long story short is the signal transformation also plays a very key, even if it's balanced, unbalanced, but signal transformation was a key aspect to it. Sorry, I think I went
Maybe
too
that's
long.
a good segue to your next topic, Akhilesh. Yeah, so maybe I'll hand it over to Akhilesh for the next topic now, which is LSTMs. So do you want to take it from here, Akhilesh?
Sure, Kirthi. So, perfect. Thank you. So keeping that validation aspect in mind again, so the first approach was using the CNNs, but then it has a few challenges of its own. The first challenge being is that, getting that CNN to be validated and verified is still very difficult because there are so many different layers, like 25 layers. The AlexNet, which is the simplest network, has 25, but then the thing which most of the people are using right now has like 100 layers, 200 layers, and it can be pretty deep. And getting that certified is a big challenge. So the idea was like, if we have a shorter network or a shallow network, it might be a little easier to comprehend how that network behaves and predict what are my results. So that was what we were going after. And Kirthi, can you go to the next slide, please?
Please, yes.
that is the technique which we're going after. And the idea was like, okay, let's skip the image part because convolution network has the challenges. Let's try to train it directly on the signals. And again, my background being heavily signal processing, that was my own personal inclination as well. So recurrent neural networks can be used to train like signal data and sequence data. But my goal was that if I'm going to do a classification network, I won't use like 200 layers. I'll just use 5 or 6 layers, the basic minimum layers, and see if I can get something meaningful out of it. So we use this long short-term memory network, and not to go in details, but this layer actually has some memory elements to it, which allows you to kind of retain the previous states as the new signals are coming in. Maybe most of us are already familiar, but I don't want to dive too much deep in this one. Kirthi, can you go to the next one, please?
Yeah.
But so we wanted to use that LSTM, and when I started with the LSTM directly on the raw samples, which is 65,000 samples long, the network never trained. And that was expected because the data is too long, data is highly non-stationary, it is changing, I mean QRS complex, and it would never ever train because within the time frame of 65,000 samples long, the features were constantly changing and it was not giving any meaningful. But the solution was that, which I just called out a few minutes back, is can I preserve the relevant features, also reduce the dimensionality? So relevant features, again, what I mean by that is how 10 patients' normal sinus rhythms are similar versus how it's different from the arrhythmia and congestive heart failure for the 100 different patients. And the solution which we tried was the wavelet scattering networks, and using that pre-processing technique with LSTMs was the solution. So a little bit on wavelet scattering network. So because we had already seen good performance with the scaleogram using wavelets, the scattering networks is kind of in a way analogous to a convolution neural network. But the main thing is that now we are operating not, instead of using the filter banks of a convolution layer, we're using a wavelet convolution filter banks. And then there's some non-linearity operation and a pooling operation. So the structure is very similar to the CNNs, but the difference is that all the weights are fixed. And this can easily be interpreted as any other, it is although complex, but just a standard low pass, high pass filter. If the steps we would take to verify and validate that, this filter is almost more or less the same because there's no adaptive processing happening over here. Everything in this filter bank is fixed. And with this transformation, we get some features which we can train on the classifiers. And those features like were very rich. And the dimensionality reduction was like from 65,000 samples for one signal, we went down to 499 samples. So almost 95% reduction in size. And that's what we use to train the deep learning network. So this is just a little bit more about how the scattering and scaleogram coefficients kind of come out in this scattering framework. It is a little bit complex, but as far as the understanding it goes, the filter banks again are constant. And for each step of the transformation of the data, we get scaleogram coefficients, and then we get scattering coefficients by doing a scaling operation. And we just capture those scattering coefficients, which we use for training. And then when we trained our LSTM at that point, the LSTM had only 5 layers, only one LSTM, and the fully connected 2 layers were the learnable layers. Everything else is the standard layers. So a shallow structure, wavelet scattering, rich features, we got a much better performance, I would say. But can you go to the next slide, Kirthi, please?
Yeah.
But the good thing with this, that not only we are getting this good accuracy, like it was still the full accuracy which we got on the test data set, but now this network is very shallow, so the inference speed was also less. And at the same time, the important aspect in my opinion was, now with a shallow network, it's easy to verify, validate, and understand the predictions as well. So that was a huge value add I got out of the wavelet scattering networks. We'll take a quick pause, and I just have more 5 minutes left, but any questions, or Kirthi, would you like to add anything else at this point?
I think it's actually, I don't have anything.
I had a question. Can I? So,
Yes, sir.
so really two questions. One is, I think the LSTM was, a fantastic piece of insight, but LSTM really sort of flourishes when you have variable size data. Here you already had an equal, size of the data, which was great. But in some sense, the LSTM could have been used, but it may be considered overkill. That's just a comment. But what I wanted to get at was, if you actually use the LSTM on data that was not of the same size, would you still end up getting 499 samples, or would that now vary by the size of the data?
That's a great question. So it would vary by the size of the data, because there are parameters in the wavelet scattering networks which we can tweak, and that changes the size of the features in the output. But if we choose a standard filter bank for all my data sets, then definitely the feature size would be different. But having said that, to your point, you have a very good point. Because LSTM is more or less size agnostic, then even with variable sized features, we can definitely train the LSTMs. I haven't tried it, but for other data sets for a different problem, I have tried that, and it gave us a good result as well.
Okay, thanks. The second question was, I love the fact that you brought wavelets into this picture, but there's so much of, in the wavelet literature, there is just so much of possibilities in terms of choosing the right kind of mother wavelet and the daughter wavelets, as well as the filter bank structure. Which one did you pick for this problem, and why?
That's a great question. Maybe Kirthi, I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So in fact, the scattering network that we showed you earlier, that was only possible with one wavelet. I think it's the default is the Morley, I believe. That's the only one wavelet it kind of supports at this moment. And there was no motivation for us to kind of look into other wavelets there. So that's why it's just one wavelet. The user does not have to worry about those things. And it's just basically they have to take a signal, and that network kind of works. There are certain restrictions that it works on. So it really works on a particular wavelet there.
The reason I ask is because in the beginning, you had this great slide that talks about the choice of different time frequency representations that is motivated by the context of the signal.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you had any intuition to offer on when you do this with wavelet scattering, where you need a prescribed filter bank, what might be a good way to think about other choices of wavelet filter banks?
Yeah, unfortunately, the network won't converge if you use other wavelets. It's only tuned for one particular wavelet, and people didn't find. And when we poured through the research, we didn't find motivation for looking at supporting other wavelets there. So it's just one wavelet filter bank.
Thank you so much.
Yes, and I would make a quick comment on that. So there are definitely techniques I found in literature where people have used a discrete wavelet transform to extract features as well. And over there, we can use a wide variety of wavelet like Coif wavelet, FK, DB, HAR wavelets, and whatnot. So a whole library is there. But if I were to go down that route, we are a little bit more analytical in that sense. Like we can try with all the wavelets and get whatever gives us the most performance and use that as our final approach, I guess. And that's how I would go about that piece, because we have that flexibility to kind of choose between everything which is supported.
Yeah. Thanks.
So just to interrupt for a brief second here, time check. I think we have like 10 minutes. So, and we don't have a lot of slides here, right? Maybe we can just quickly go through this and take any questions after that, if that's okay with the audience. Okay, so let's just cover that. Go ahead, Akhilesh, sorry.
Sure. Yeah, I'll just be real quick. So just getting a step ahead of of this AI piece. Now, again, keeping that validation aspect in mind. So in literature, what we saw is that, okay, deep learning models are a little bit more transparent still. I mean, we did reduce the problem to using a LSTM, but still explainability and interpretability could be a challenge in the medical industry. People have already kind of solved it, but still it's challenging. And then we thought that, okay, can we do the same thing with machine learning as well? Because machine learning are a little more, bit more simpler models for that matter. And that's where we started trying. So feature engineering is a key aspect in machine learning. We can not feed the direct signals. Again, feature transformation was required. And there's so many different techniques, signal processing methods, statistical methods, time domain based, frequency domain based, and whatnot. And what we did was, here are a few techniques like, like spectral statistics, octave spectrum. In the time domain, we have many techniques like a peak detection and whatnot. So, there's a whole world out there. In a few literatures, we saw that they had trained the machine learning model. So I've got the references at the bottom by using the autoregressive coefficients using the Berg method, and then also using the Shannon entropy values for a discrete wavelet packet transform, where we tried it with different wavelets, and then also the multifractal wavelet leader estimates of the second cumulative of scaling components and Holder exponents. So the literature is, you can find it in the references. Now, using this technique, we trained a simple classifier like the SVM, the support vector machines, and the network is so shallow, or the algorithm is so fast. Now you can see that the inference speed has come down to almost like 0.5 milliseconds, or sorry, 0.05 milliseconds, which is very fast because the structure is very, very shallow. But having said that, there's another thing I would like to add. Kirthi, can you go to the next slide?
Yeah.
That manual feature extraction, as you saw on my slide, it was a cumbersome process. It took us very long time to figure that out, which features to use, how will they work, and what the accuracy will we get. So it took us like I spent almost like over a month in finding all the literature search and implementing something. And that too, it was not my original. I had to take the references from other literature. But then since we already had some good performance with wavelet scattering, it's like, okay, can we do that wavelet scattering and leverage the automated feature extraction? Because wavelet scattering is literally like one function call in the tools which we were using. And as it turns out, wavelet scattering also gave us the same accuracy with that same machine learning SVM model, which is a lot much easier to validate. The cost was that the inference speed was a slightly higher, but then we saved all that time in extracting the manual features and whatnot. Everything was just one function call for us. So with that, maybe Kirthi, I'll pass it off to you for the final conclusion.
Yeah, thanks, Akhilesh. I think hopefully when you look at this, the summary of today's talk is, I mean, there is no one approach that kind of fits very well, right? So to conclude the topic, it really kind of depends on what you're trying to do. And certain cases, you probably need the computation. Maybe you don't really want to spend a lot of time. And if you have lots of data, maybe this approach, the first approach could be good. Or if you're really looking to work with getting some, making your regulatory process a little more easier in terms of making sure that you know what's going on in the algorithm, maybe there are some other approaches here, right? But again, there's no right or wrong answer. So just to conclude, it really depends on your application, the kind of problem you're looking to solve. And sometimes, like one example I can give you is there's a patient monitoring system that's right next to the bed. Maybe there's not enough time to go to the cloud and come back. So that's one consideration. Or if you're looking to kind of deploy these healthcare solutions in areas where there is no internet, right? I mean, which is, there's a lot of a huge chunk of the world still does not have access to internet and those things. So maybe an embedded device could actually do, maybe it could help save lives there, right? So that could also dictate the choice of the technique you use. So those are the questions and the conclusions we have. So again, I hope you all enjoyed this. So now we will open up the floor for questions, and yeah, so can take it from there.
Yeah, and this is Marla real quick. We only have a few minutes left, and so we can take a question or two, but just real quick, we do have a whole community involved in artificial intelligence, including this network. And again, it is strictly, I guess, kept to AI experts like yourselves, and we meet every other month. And you can see the schedule here. I believe it's also on our website. And we have AI working teams that really get into the medical devices or pharmaceutical processing, quality systems, working with FDA and things like that. So if you're interested in joining one of those teams, you can as well. The only thing I'll ask is, if you have ideas for future topics, go ahead and put those in the chat box while we're taking a couple of questions here at the end. So anyone who would like to unmute your line and ask a question, or Arvind, if you see something in the chat box, we have a couple minutes.
I think Arvind just left, Marla.
Okay, that would make it hard for him to see the chat box. Since we're using my screen, it's hard for me to do the chat box, but
yeah, I can take a look at the chat.
Okay.
And
okay. But in the meantime, does anyone have a question you'd like to unmute and ask?
I've got a quick one. Using defined relevant features or not was introduced, and the approach to it was kind of discussed. I'm just curious, it seems to me that it's a completely different question. It's a completely different problem to begin the search with defined relevant features versus not. Is that true? And would you design your algorithms, your choice of algorithms, your data sets, your scaling transformations differently with a well-defined a priori set of defined features versus not?
So can you please repeat the question there? I didn't get the last part.
Oh, it's just yes or no. Would you approach the problem differently if you had an a priori defined set of relevant features in the frequencies versus not, versus using the algorithms to find relevant features?
Yeah, so I think to answer that question, if we already knew those features, then we probably don't even go through this approach, right? So the answer would be no, we don't probably. I think no, in the sense that we probably not use these techniques. We probably can use some other techniques there.
Thanks. I guess I didn't understand the question then.
All right, any other questions?
Kirthi, I'll just make
Oh, go ahead, Akhilesh.
I'll just make a small comment to that, William. So I think if we already have the features, then we'll go definitely start training our deep learning or machine learning models, and we have like a huge universe out there which model to choose from. That's a total different discussion. But we can start training that, and then our goal would be more to, I guess, fine tune our models and to get the maximum performance, I guess. So if we already have the features, then directly let's go to the modeling part. Would be my take.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, we might have time for one more question if somebody has a question. No? Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us, and Akhilesh and Kirthi, thank you so much for putting together such a thought-provoking presentation that really generated a lot of discussion, way above my head, by the way. But this is perfect. There are so many of you out there who are AI experts, and you're kind of like an island. You're out there by yourselves, and it's great to be able to bring you together so you can talk shop, share ideas, and then go back to the communities where you are and make a difference. And that's what we like to do at Xavier Health. So thank you so much for joining us, and look forward to having you join us in the future for this network or any of the other work that we have going on. Have a great rest of your Friday.
Thank you, Marla. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Marla. Thanks, everyone. Bye.